This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
Welcome to today's program. I'm Roby Brock. We are joined by Governor Asa Hutchinson of the great state of Arkansas. Good to see you as always.
Good to be with you.
I always enjoy sitting down and visiting with you. We have had a troublesome last week to 10 days in national politics, particularly centered around this whole issue of racism and hate groups. And then I think there is overlap, but it is also a separate issue in terms of gun control, gun access in this country. Let's talk about both of those in some separate ways here. Let's begin with hate groups. Do you think that we have a white nationalist problem in this country?
I do. I think there's been some resurgence of it. Obviously, it's a minority. It's not reflecting of America, but we saw this in the 80s. We prosecuted them. We stood out against them. We've seen it diminish, but then I think you have seen some resurgence of it in recent years. And so I think it is, and the fact that in El Paso is certainly evidence of that. But it's been a problem that every generation has to confront, and leaders need to speak out about it. We've seen it, and I wanted to make sure that I spoke out about it this week. Two different approaches really that you see. Some immediately move toward, well, we got to control guns. That's not acceptable in Arkansas, and that's not the right solution. The other solution is an enforcement issue. And so that's one of the reasons I've advocated for hate crimes legislation. That's a better enforcement tool to diminish and to make sure that we hold accountable those people that will target individuals because of their race, religion, etc.
Do you think a hate crime law would deter this type of behavior? Because it seems like it's a much deeper rooted, much more difficult, complex problem than just knowing that there's a law in the books that could enhance your penalty to me.
Well, sure, it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of different aspects to it. But there's a difference between what we see in domestic terrorism and what we see in international terrorism. International terrorism, the jihadist version of it, they put on a suicide vest, they go in, they blow themselves up because life's not precious to them. But on the other hand, you look at domestic terrorism, most of our domestic terrorism incidents is people are trying to survive. The perpetrator does not put on a suicide vest, they put on armor protection equipment because they want to live. And so if you enhance penalty, you put the death penalty in play, then I do believe that it's necessary as a consequence, but also there is a statement that we take this very seriously. We want to discourage that behavior.
Should a hate crime law also include sexual orientation and gender identity?
It should. No one should be targeted because of who they are. And this, if you're having somebody does a crime spree and robs 10 places, there shouldn't be, because one of them happens to be a Jewish owner of the business, they don't get an enhancement unless because they're Jewish, they targeted that business, and there should be. So if someone targets because of whether it's sexual orientation or whether it's because of their religion, there should be an enhancement. There should be a greater penalty. We've got to discourage that because that's hate. And this is one enforcement tool that we can adopt that does discourage, does send a message in our society that we're not going to tolerate that kind of hate that leads to violence against groups.
You told the Arkansas Sheriff's Association this week in a public speech that you had concerns for the Jewish community in Arkansas, that they had maybe brought concerns to you about what they were seeing here. Is there a credible threat against the Jewish community in Arkansas? Is there something tangible that has happened?
I cannot point to any specific threat that obviously that's something that law enforcement would handle. But in terms of general intelligence information, that whenever you have an upsurge in white supremacy activity, that one of the consequences of that is the anti-Semitic violence that could be attributed to it. We've seen that across the nation, and Arkansas is something that I think we need to speak out as leaders that that's not acceptable in Arkansas, and that does not reflect us, and that's one of the reasons I spoke out. But I don't want to create alarm there, but I do I have visited with the Jewish community, and they are concerned about some of the discussions that are out there, whether it's on the internet or some of the intelligence that they're aware of in terms of anti-Semitic behavior. And even though it might just be words now, if that leads to action, then that's why they invest more in security of their premises and synagogues, and rightfully so.
Other groups too? Do you feel like there's other groups that are potentially being threatened or could be threatened because of what you're seeing in terms of the intelligence that comes to you from the state police?
That's all I would point to. That's usually the first target, and regretfully so. But white supremacy hurts everyone, and usually it is just simply dialogue that is wrong, but it also leads other people to actions because of a mindset that's created and irrational fears that are created. And so it really hurts all minorities, but the anti-Semitic conduct and violence seems to be the first that they turn to.
You mentioned it earlier, your prosecutorial history. For those who are not familiar with old Asa Hutchinson, Asa Hutchinson 1.0, you were a prosecutor in the mid-'80s, and you led a negotiated, kind of peaceful apprehension of a white supremacist group of leaders in north central Arkansas back in the day. This was the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. So you obviously have a steeped history in white supremacy and how it acts in that respect. And I've read some of the FBI declassified documents on this, which is pretty interesting. What's different in what you're seeing now versus what you saw then?
Well, first of all, just let me emphasize that the CSA, which was a white nationalist, white supremacy group, they targeted Jewish businesses. They targeted the gay population. They committed acts of violence all across Missouri and Arkansas.
One of them murdered a state trooper that happened to be African American.
Absolutely. So a whole host of very, very violent crimes. We prosecuted them, and it diminished after we sent them to prison. Now, in the 90s, you had Timothy McVeigh over in Oklahoma City that had connections with some of the same extreme right-wing groups. So you have to take them very seriously. What is different today is the mass media. It is the social media that you can't control it as much, and it's harder to get the intelligence information on all the threats that are out there. In the 80s, it was multiple groups in different physical locations. Today, you might have physical locations, but you also have individual actors that are located in the basement of some house that drives 400 miles to carry out an act of violence. So it's what we see different today is the social media, the reach that they can have with much more limited effort.
In the wake of 9/11, you were with the Department of Homeland Security when, I don't think it was under your purview, but you were certainly familiar with this. The U.S. government started to surveil conversations, and there's a stringent process for that. We've seen that scrutinized, where we've monitored what's going on in particularly the Islamic radical community there. Should we be surveilling, or do you know if we are surveilling white supremacists at this point in time?
Certainly the FBI still has a responsibility for domestic terrorism that would include some of the radicalized groups. I know that they do have intelligence on those. It's a question of balancing of resources. And post 9/11, you saw almost, well, it was a shift, but it was a very intense investigation of resources into the radical Islamic terrorism. The foreign terrorism that might threaten us just like at 9/11. And so that was the focus, and now we have to rebalance this and recognize that we have two threats. One, the domestic terrorism variety of the extremist groups right here, and then the second one remains, and you can't diminish that, which is the Islamic radical type of terrorism. So we've got to actually look at both. I know the FBI is devoting resources, and I think they've balanced a little bit better today.
All right, let's turn our attention to gun violence. As we said, this has been some of the outcome of these hate groups here. We've heard a variety of reasons for why the United States has some of the gun violence and the mass shooting problems that we have seen. We have heard people talk about, mental illness as a part of that. I've heard some politicians talk about video games, lack of prayer. There's this racism and bigotry that we talked about. Why do you think that we are seeing the rise in gun violence that we're seeing?
I wish we knew. I do think that, first of all, the challenge that we have with mental illness in our country is a part of it. When you look at the mass shootings, 1/3 of those are the perpetrator has some identifiable mental illness, and so it is a factor there. And then you've got, the very definition of terrorism is that you're using violence for a political purpose. And so you've got radicalized groups from the left and from the right that resort to violence. So that's a law enforcement challenge and an intelligence gathering challenge. So all of that combined, leads us to say there's multiple causes for it. In terms of the mental health side, I'm very proud of Arkansas with our investment of crisis stabilization units. That is novel from across the country. We're doing it uniquely, and I think it will make a difference in having a means to treat those in a community-based environment that law enforcement might come across that need to be referred to as mental health assistance.
I want to read you something from David Froome, noted Republican, writes for The Atlantic here. He says, every country has mentally ill, every country has video games, every country has people who don't pray, every country has racists. Only America has near daily mass shootings. It's the guns. I didn't mention gun access earlier. Is gun access, is that part of the problem as well?
Well, whenever you look at mass killings, we've seen airplanes used for that purpose. You've seen machete attacks used for that purpose, and you've seen firearms used for that purpose. And the United States is a huge population, and so obviously there's a lot of focus, and we do have more than what we would like. But it is something that you see, whether it's in Sweden or whether it's in Australia. You've seen these type of attacks as well, some of them for the same type of radicalized purposes. But there's a national conversation going on, and it's going to continue to looking at all aspects of that. But I know that it first starts with, first of all, the individual and their heart, and that somebody is very evil that does this. So we got to address, to the extent that we can, how do you have better hearts in America? And then secondly, it's about enforcement, and that's what we go to first. Let's enforce the law, let's gather the intelligence on it. I think you've got to look at the mental health. I don't see, while I think it's a fair discussion on making sure that our laws are effective in keeping felons from having it, or those with adjudicated mental illness from having firearms they shouldn't have access to. Let's tighten up those legitimate areas of concern. That's a fair discussion.
Some Second Amendment supporters say constitutional carry or open carry would be a deterrent to these types of mass shooting situations. Do you believe that?
Well, I just saw the anecdote of in El Paso, there was one CBP officer that left their firearm at home. And they were there in the store where the mass shooter started opening fire, and I know that CBP officer would have liked to have the firearm at that particular moment. But they really were trained. They understand how to respond to that. Individuals have the right to protect themselves, and so that's an important constitutional right. Does that, in fact, deter mass shooters? I think if there is a law enforcement presence, a security presence that's visible in stores, and you're going to see more of that, that is a deterrent, absolutely. They're not going to be going to a hardened target. They're going to be looking for some place that does not have that kind of security protection. So the first option for businesses, for churches, is to have that kind of protection in place, but obviously individual right to protect themselves is important too.
The folks who advocate more gun control have thrown out a laundry list of possible things to consider. I think this is part of that national discussion that you're talking about. I just want to get your take on a couple of those issues. Mandatory universal background checks, where you check the criminal history, you check the signs for domestic violence, mental illness. Is that something that should be strengthened in terms of the law?
Now, when you're talking about mandatory universal, that means that if a homeowner has a gun and wants to sell it to a neighbor, you're not going to be able to do that. Without the background check, you're going to require the citizens to go down and find a firearms dealer and go through the check system. If you want to pass along your firearm to your son, or if you're going to pass away and you allow somebody to inherit that, I mean, you cannot have that type of universal. Now, I do believe that we need to make sure that we have the right information in the data system, and that when you're buying it from a commercial dealer, that you can have that check. But when the word universal, that's a little bit problematic, balancing that with freedoms.
Okay. What about reporting practices between legitimate gun shop owners? Is there a way to strengthen the law there? This is another idea that gets floated out there a lot, is that there should be a better registration system so people know where the guns are.
Well, no, I don't know that the government should know where guns are. I don't think they need to know how many firearms I have in my home, or any citizen has. So I'm not sure I follow that logic there.
Well, I think the logic is that if there are suspicious transactions, somebody comes in and loads up with a lot of weapons in one, over a short period of time, or maybe in one trip or something like that. Much like a druggist might report someone buying a lot of over-the-counter kind of drugs for something that could be used for a nefarious purpose.
Sure, that's important. That's important information. For example, pawn shop owners generally are good actors and good cooperators with law enforcement, and if someone comes in and they buy a massive amount of firearms, or they act suspicious, we need to have that kind of cooperation with law enforcement, saying, hey, this could pose a risk, or we want you to know about this massive purchase. So they use good judgment. It's not a mandatory government requirement, but it's a good citizen response.
Yeah. Last question on this issue, unless you say something else that warrants another question here. Red flag laws, you talked about this week in a pen and pad with some reporters. You've not found something that is a good balancing act of constitutional protection as well as protecting the public in terms of public safety. What's tripping you up on that from the legislation, the drafts that you've seen? Where are you getting hung up on that?
Well, that it's a simple probable cause requirement to take someone's firearms away. That's a very low standard of proof. And I know that in many circumstances that you're going to have false reports come in. There's anger at someone, and so you give the police a report saying he's got firearms and he's threatened to kill people. Well, the police is going to respond to that and say, we can't risk it by not taking his firearms away, because we'll be held accountable because we didn't take action. So they're going to lean forward to do that, and so there's it's too low of a threshold that I've seen thus far. What we want to be able to accomplish is, if you've got clear and convincing evidence, if you've got a certainty that someone is going to commit an act of violence, we've got to be able to stop that. And how do you get there in a free society when they haven't committed a criminal offense yet? That's a challenge that we have in so many different areas, but this is serious because it involves so many lives. So that's a challenge. I want to work on that to see if we can get there, but I haven't seen an answer yet.
Okay. All of this talk of the mass shootings and some of the causes and everything that we've been talking about today is knocked off of the front page of the newspaper some of your other news of this past week, and I want to give some time to talk about that too. One of the big things that you announced this past week is $25 million for broadband expansion in rural parts of the state. This was rolled out at the tail end of the legislative session there. What is your expectation of where that money will go first and how it will impact the communities you want it to impact?
Well, first of all, we set a goal to get high-speed broadband to our rural communities within the next 4 years. And that you start with communities of 500, and of course you can expand from there. We have a state broadband plan and a broadband manager. This is following suit by putting, for the first time in history, real state dollars behind our rural broadband effort. $25 million grant program. I would expect a municipality could apply for this, or it could be a rural telecom provider that needs some extra help to get that final mile in. And so I expect there'll be a broader range of creative solutions that they would apply for this, and I expect it to help us to leverage our state money with more federal dollars as well. So I hope that this makes a difference. We'll measure whether this is enough or whether we need to do more.
You're also in the midst of your transformation process. You've named your cabinet secretaries. Congratulations on that, by the way. None of them have quit yet, by the way, I might point out, so that you obviously made some good initial selections there. Where do we stand in transformation right now? You said that you are seeing some savings realized already. Where are you seeing savings realized?
Well, for example, the state police is utilizing their health insurance program. Our employee benefits division out of our shared services department, that's going to be saving them $1 million a year. Yeah. And so that's a savings. You see savings in the public safety because the state police automobile shop is able to serve a broader arena of agencies. That saves money. We're going to be saving money in some leases that we're going to be purchasing the facility and combining facilities. I'll tell you this, that we budgeted $15 million in savings in the second year of the biennium. I'm convinced now, after even 1 month, that our savings will exceed that. I'm very confident we're going to exceed that, and we're going to meet our goal earlier as well. And so this is exciting, just 1 month in, seeing the ideas that come forth, the savings that's being created, but also the improved delivery of services.
It's always difficult when you have money in some sort of surplus, Governor, because everybody wants a piece of it. When you don't have any money in surplus, there's nothing for anybody to carve up. So keep that in mind, I'm just saying. It's a good problem to have.
It is a nice problem with the surplus that we've created, and everybody has to understand that surplus sits there until the next legislative session. Right. I don't get to spend that, and which is rightfully so.
So the legislature would like some hand in how that gets spent as well. So.
And they do control the purse strings.
Yeah. Also, this past week, a group called Thumbtack recognized Arkansas as a great place to do small business. I will give you an opportunity to gloat on that.
Well, it ranked us number one in the nation. And this was a survey of 5,000 small businesses across the country. And because of our low cost of entry, our licensing reduction on the businesses, and our friendly business environment, they ranked us as number one over places like Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia. So very, very proud of that ranking. And it shows that we're going in the right direction in terms of a business-friendly environment for small businesses, startup businesses, and I hope that reputation will lead to more startups.
You also started a conversation this past week and a half about, and you told me before that you're not done with politics necessarily when you get out of the governor's office. You have mentioned if there was an opportunity, president in 2024 would be something you'd take a look at if there's a role for you there. You've ruled out a Senate challenge to Senator Bozeman if he runs for re-election. Is that correct? Well,
Senator Bozeman's doing a great job, and I hope that he runs for re-election, and I expect that he will. You know, and I've got 3.5 years more as governor. I'm enjoying this, but I want people to know that I love what I do in terms of making a difference in people's lives. If there's a future opportunity, I'm open to that, but that's a lifetime away. And whenever you're a governor, there's not many other opportunities to do what we've done here in Arkansas as governor, and I'm concerned about our country, so we'll see where that willingness to look at future public service leads us.
All right, I'll just let you know that the Auditor of State, Treasurer of State, and Attorney General are term limited. So, I mean, there's always a chance for you to look at another constitutional
Thanks for
office.
your encouragement.
Governor Asa Hutchinson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for today's program. I'm Roby Brock. We'll see you next time.